Happy Friday, everybody. It's Chris with the Sawtooth Avalanche Center with your weekend update for January 20th. As always, this is no substitute for the Avalanche forecast. Be sure to check that at www.sawtoothavalanche.com each day before you head into the backcountry. So let's start by rewinding the last weekend. It was actually a fairly interesting weekend, not so much with the weather, but with some human-triggered avalanche activity that we'll get to in just a moment. But first, the weather. We had 4 to 8 inches of new snow, and that was definitely favored the northern mountains, like the northern Sawtooth and Banner. Picked up more on the 6 to 8 end of the spectrum, and most of the rest of our area got sort of 4 to 6. We had some increasing winds Saturday night from the southeast. And while this wasn't like a real major weather event, it did add some more load to buried weak layers, including a newer layer of surface hoar, and that might have contributed to the little rash of avalanche activity we had over the weekend. As a result of that weather, the avalanche danger did increase from moderate to considerable from Saturday to Sunday. So as I alluded to, we had a little spate of human-triggered avalanches. At least 7 occurred last weekend, and there's a list of them there. We had some in the Soldiers, we had some in the White Clouds, Western Smokies, and Sawtooths. And that one in the photo there is a small slide that was triggered up Pole Creek in the White Clouds. Let's take a look at a couple of those just to get some more details. Here's a photo of one that occurred in the Fishhook Drainage. This one was actually, the Fishhook Drainage is in the Sawtooth Range in the Sawtooth and Western Smoky Zone. This one occurred on Sunday, and this one was remotely triggered from low down on the slope. So the people were touring along the bottom of the slope and gentler terrain, and collapsed the weak layer and initiated an avalanche on the slope above them. And this was at 8,700 feet on northwest aspect. So about 1.5 feet deep, maybe 2 feet deep at most. Another one occurred also in the Sawtooths in Stanley Lake Creek, and these were by motorized users. And this was a great photo the person sent, kind of explaining some of the events that happened. But as I understand it, they were up on the ridge, kind of where the first arrow is on the left, and trying to work their way through those trees. The rider got sort of sucked down onto the slope that he wasn't really planning to be on. Like he didn't really want to be there, but got sucked onto it. He did notify his friends via radio to keep an eye on him because he wasn't really that comfortable where he was. And then sure enough, he did trigger an avalanche. He felt it released. He bailed off a snowmobile, ended up landing on the bed surface, so he wasn't caught. Snowmobile did get carried downhill a little ways. And then this photo where it says, "This is me riding out," that's where he went down to get the sled and rode out the bottom of the avalanche. So fortunately, nobody caught, but a little bit of a close one. So what are some of the patterns in these this little rash of human-triggered slides? Most likely, most of them occurred on a layer of surface hoar that we formed at the start of the new year. And most were on middle elevation, shady, and relatively wind-sheltered slopes. And this is what we would consider sort of the, quote, classic locations for surface hoar preservation. And we'll get to that in just a minute. So these avalanches weren't, huge. About half of them were large enough to bury or injure people, but all of these were capable of carrying somebody into a gully through trees or over cliffs. And we'll talk about this in a bit more in a second. But surface hoar avalanches can be a little sneaky because they often occur in sort of innocuous little places, maybe not the super obvious starting zones and avalanche paths. So let's talk a little bit about surface hoar. It's kind of an interesting and good time to learn a little bit more about it. We get surface hoar here all the time, but we don't often actually bury it. So most of you know what surface hoar is. This is really pretty kind of crystalline frost feathers that form on the snow surface. It's like winter's equivalent of dew, but just frozen. So it forms when we have clear, cold nights. So we get quite a few of those around here. The trick is that when it's on the surface, it's very fragile. So in order to bury it, it needs to be preserved upright. If we get sun, it can melt it pretty quickly. Wind tends to blow it over. So a lot of times it gets destroyed before it actually gets buried. But every once in a while, we form it and then we bury it pretty quickly. It doesn't need to be buried by a lot of snow. It can be buried just by a few inches in order to preserve it standing upright. And that's what we did at the start of the new year. Actually buried a couple layers of surface ore. If you dig a snow pit, it's not always obvious, but sometimes it presents itself as a gray stripe in a snow pit. Here's one that JP dug, and you can actually see 2 layers of surface ore. And this was when he was investigating the crown of an avalanche that occurred right when the surface ore got buried in Camp Creek above Galena Summit. So if surface ore is buried intact, it does form kind of a nasty weak layer. And you can see it's just like little miniature potato chips, and you put a slab on top of that. Those potato chips will hold quite a bit in compression, but doesn't take much to knock those over and have that slab run downhill. And this is a photo Ben took on Banner Summit of some of those preserved surface ore grains. So as I mentioned, they have some interesting characteristics. They're very fragile, so they're easily destroyed. And because of that, it's not an all or nothing thing. Sometimes they're destroyed on some slopes, but remain intact and standing upright on others. And that leads to a spotty distribution if we do bury these weak layers. And so you got to ask yourself, what are the slopes that are the least likely to have the conditions that would destroy the surface ore? Well, those tend to be the shady ones that aren't getting the sun that would melt it, and tend to be the wind protected ones where the wind isn't blowing the surface ore over. So that's what we consider sort of that classic surface ore preservation terrain. And that pattern actually matches quite a few of the avalanches that we happened. A lot of them, again, occurred on middle elevation, shady, and fairly wind sheltered slopes. And because they're not, these can be like these little pockets in the trees. They can be little slopes above terrain traps and gullies and creeks. They can catch folks off guard, and they don't need to be a big avalanche in order to be dangerous. We did have another slide that was triggered sort of midweek. This is on Tuesday, and it occurred on Wells Summit, which is north of Fairfield. And not really easy to see what's going on in this photo, but a rider had made a pass across the top of the slope, and the maid was coming back and making a second pass when he triggered this avalanche. We can't say for sure, but it does sort of match the pattern of some of the other surface ore avalanches we saw. Again, not a real big slide. Probably wouldn't bury you if it just went into a nice clean run out zone. But if you look at the second photo, it actually ran down into what appears to be a bit of a gully and also piled up against some trees. So fortunately, this rider wasn't caught. Everything turned out fine. But just a good example of how these little potentially surface ore slides can be dangerous, especially with terrain traps below. So where does that leave us for the coming weekend? Let's start by taking a look at the weather, and just threw a little weather forecast up there for Galena Summit, since it's kind of right in the middle of our whole forecast area. And it looks to be pretty cold overall. Tomorrow, being Saturday, looks to be a nice, sunny, fantastic day. And then a little weather system moves in Saturday night. It should bring pretty minuscule amounts of snow. It looks like 1 to maybe 3 inches in some of the areas that are favored, which will tend to be the northwestern mountains. But maybe the bigger story will be increasing winds Saturday night into Sunday. And then Sunday looks to be even colder as we get more and more of that air mass coming down from the north. And then looking ahead into the crystal ball, the long-term forecast is looking pretty dry. We had a pretty good run of it there. Pretty snowy winter so far. We're still sitting well above average snowpack, but it does look like things are going to calm down weather-wise for a fair bit. And then let's look at the avalanche conditions for this weekend. As you know, if you've been reading the avalanche forecast, we have a number of weak layers in the snowpack. And we have the surface ore and also some facets and crust, which are about 1 to 2 feet down. So we've talked quite a bit about the surface ore part of that, of those weak layers. And those avalanches are possible, and they will tend to be up to small or large, in the small to large size range. And then we also have deeper layers buried 2 to 4 feet down in the snowpack. And so these are less likely. So these are actually unlikely you would trigger one. So less likely than the weak layers further up in the snowpack, and that makes sense because when the weak layers are closer to the surface, they're more easily triggered. These deeper ones are harder to impact with our weight, so they're unlikely to trigger. But the flip side of that is they would likely produce a large to very large avalanche. So it's going to be much more dangerous than triggering an avalanche on the layers further up in the snowpack, even though they are less likely to trigger the deeper ones. So hopefully that makes sense. We've been talking a little bit about that in the forecast, so tune in more, tune in more, and you'll get some more details on that in the forecast this weekend. So avalanches aren't likely, but they're more likely on very steep slopes over 35 degrees. So why is that? When we have a stabilizing snowpack, which is what we have, things are improving. They're not, totally improved, but they are trending in the right direction, and conditions seem to stabilize more slowly on those very steep slopes over 35 degrees. They're more likely on shady aspects. So why is that? We talked a bit earlier about the surface order being more likely to be preserved on the shady aspects versus the sunny ones, where the sun can melt off the surface ore before it gets buried. And then wind-loaded slopes, and why are avalanches more likely on those? And when the wind adds more load to the slopes, those have more of a slab sitting atop those weak layers, and they take longer to heal and tend to stabilize more slowly. So they tend to be where danger lingers the longest. So if you avoided terrain with most of these characteristics, you would be unlikely to trigger an avalanche. So that's all I got for you. Have a great weekend, and be sure to check the avalanche forecast before you go out each day, www.sawtoothavalanche.com. And thank you so much for watching.